Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first faculty graduate student seminar of the calendar year 2018, and certainly this is not the first in our series during the academic year. My name is Csaba Nikolenyi. I'm a professor of political science and also director of the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. Today we have a very interesting, very nice mixture of presentations on the panel from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds. I'm going to soon share the brief bios of the presenters. Two of the presenters. I'm not going to tell you more about myself because you probably know more about me than you ever wanted to. We do have, however, two very talented and yet distinguished graduate students with us today whose work we have supported over the years, whose performance and progress we are very, very supportive of and proud of. And it brings me a special delight to see both Collier and Jessica be on this panel today because over the years I've seen them grow and I've worked with them in different capacities and opportunities. So it's great to be on the same panel with you, and it's great to have you here with us today. Our first speaker today is going to be Collier, who comes to the event from the Department of Religions and Cultures. Chloe received her bachelor's degree from New Brunswick at Mount Allison University in Sackville. She did her honors degree in religious studies. She focused on Protestant prophecy and Protestant prophecy beliefs and American presidency, which reminds me that Chloe has a very interesting marriage, if you will, of interest coming from religious studies, sociology, and political science. Not surprisingly, Chloe graduated with distinctions. She is currently pursuing her master's degree at Concordia at the Department of Religions and Cultures. She has a particular interest in Israel mythical, not mystical, but mythical geography. And today in the presentation you are going to hear more about the details of her research interest and her actual research. I'm very happy and delighted to share the good news with you that Chloe has been accepted to the PhD program of Toronto University of Toronto. She hasn't made up her mind yet whether she will accept it or not, which is a fantastic opportunity to be in. And we have no doubt, Chloe, that whether you take this opportunity or another opportunity, you will continue to bring pride to your alma mater, and we will always be following your academic and scholarly growth. So whatever you decide, good luck. Chloe was an intern at the Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. It was a program that we developed in partnership with the Concordia's Department of Religions and Cultures, thanks to the Associate Director of the Institute, Dr. Joseph, who played an instrumental role in making the program take off. Chloe is also past recipient of our graduate Montefiore Scholarship Program, and we are very happy, as I mentioned earlier, to support her work through that program as well. Our second speaker today will be Jessica Simon. Jessica is currently pursuing her master's degree here at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Jessica was also, it's a very important element of our institutional history. Jessica was the first graduate from the undergraduate Israel Studies minor that we established 6 years ago when we created the institute. And Jessica has been ever since a very important member of our institute student community. Whenever there is an opportunity to volunteer, to pull your weight, to pull her weight, whether it's seminar organization, whether it's work at the reading room, or being part of the team of volunteers who helped us organize and pull off the international conference 3 years ago, Jessica is always there for us to rely on. So thank you, Jessica. Like Chloe, Jessica is also past recipient of the Montefiore Graduate Student Scholarship. She's currently studying issues of identity, transnationalism, community, migration, tourism, as well as religion. She's an alumna, past participant of the TAGDI program, and as we are going to hear today, that experience has fundamentally shaped her research interest. Jessica is completing currently her master's at this department under the supervision of Professor Meir Amor, who is also a very important pillar of our faculty group at the Institute. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm turning the floor over to our first speaker, Chloe. We agreed that everybody would have 20 minutes. I'm going to show you that nasty sign which says 5 minutes left. About 5 minutes towards the end. Then I will show you another nasty reminder that will say 1 minute left. And then the last reminder will just simply say time is up. So at that point, please conclude so that we could turn the floor over to the next presenter. Chloe, the floor is yours.
I've ever been presented in such nice words, and yeah, it was really nice to hear. So I'm actually very excited to present this to you today, because this is something that's been in the works actually for a long time, even before I really knew that this is what I was going to be focusing on. As it was mentioned, I mean, at first I was doing something totally different, but like I like to say, the Protestants and the evangelicals brought me to the Temple Mount, so I landed there. And this is also something that I'm currently working on, and this is what I'll be speaking about today. So it is still a bit rough around the edges. This is a framework that I'm using to try to establish something, but I will say that I know that there's some finessing to be done with the flow of my ideas, but I think I'll be able to convince you of something in the end. Okay, so of course, Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is, of course, a very important, significant site for many reasons. I won't go over them because I assume we've all heard about them, but it's interesting because it is a site where the dynamics of power are particularly unique in Israel and Palestine, which is what first drew me to understanding what was happening there. It also is interesting to me because as a scholarly topic, I found that it was being discussed in a pretty unilateral way, in a way where it was often just used as a placeholder for representing the religious conflict. It wasn't something that was being studied in a more social, cultural way because people were always kind of stopping at what is the political turmoil. And that's what led me to want to push a bit beyond. So it's not to say that I don't think that there's politics completely entrenched within whatever happens at the site. It's just, I think that there are other things that need to be tweezed out to understand and to appreciate, appreciate what's happening in a different way. Because sometimes politics can seem a bit unemotional and cold, but when you look at the social aspect, it kind of brings a humanity back to it. So because I was interested in the national identity and also in the production of memory, I wanted to understand how this place, at least the Temple Mount, not Al-Haram al-Sharif, Temple Mount could be a landscape from which a new cultural or collective memory could be produced. And then I was alerted to a very odd phenomenon that is quite recent, but it's gained a lot of popularity recently, which is a small group, or sorry, I should say groups of Jewish people who, as per their observance, are disregarding the rabbinic injunction not to enter the site and are actually entering the site they cannot do any external prayers, but they can go there as a moment of reflection. That is the only way that they're allowed to for the moment. So there's the sign discouraging people. Of course, if you want to go for touristic purposes, you can, but this is something that's among, I would say, observant people. This is usually understood. And so this movement interested me because people are, again, going back to how the Temple Mount has been characterized, people have been characterized this movement as being entirely politically motivated and almost to be more of a confrontational affair. And it's not to say that there aren't those aspects in what's happening, but again, it's taking a bit away of some of the underlying motivations that could be there. It seems almost cold that people are purposely doing this just to, out of unemotional political conviction. So that's why I wanted to look more at this group, because I was interested in seeing how, if we were to reframe the Temple Mount itself and how it acts within larger society, maybe we could understand their actions as also representing something a bit different. So again, not dismissing the political aspects of it, but also trying to reframe, to recategorize what's happening there. And so these are the people, they're different groups, it's not just one group. And so my research premise, again, a bit rough around the edges, is that in the hopes of considering the Temple Mount as a memory site, which is, in other words, an open-ended symbolic system, and it reflects a dominant ideology, and it also shapes the community's sense of self, we can then consider these groups' religious ascensions as, to a certain extent, contributing to and shaping wider Jewish Israeli memory and identity. There's a lot to unpack there because there's still, it seems like I'm making some kind of leap. So my goal today is to kind of tease out, I guess, the different aspects that could perhaps convince you that there's more to it and that this actually could be considered to be a reflection of collective memory creating and commemoration, and that it is something else in a cultural aspect. And so I'll just be going over what a memory site is, and then memory sites in the Israeli context, because there are a lot of those with the Zionist history, and then the Temple Mount as a memory site. And this is what I'll be mostly focusing on today. And in the future, I want to spend more time on teasing out pilgrimage as a form of memory and memory creation. I won't talk about it a lot today, but I will touch upon it. So memory sites, or lieu de mémoire, is something that was first coined by Csaba, and I put his explanation here because he can say it better than I ever will. So a lieu de mémoire is a significant entity, whether material or non-material in nature, which by dint of human will or the work of time has become a symbolic element of the memorial heritage of any community. So the key here is obviously symbolic element, but actually it's also that it can be material and non-material. I think that that's first what might trip up when trying to understand what is a memory site, because you think of a physical location, but it can also just be a visual expression. As long as it manifests itself materially, it can be considered a memory site. So a flag can be a memory site. A language can be a memory site. A museum, monuments, etc. These are all examples of memory sites. So memory sites, and how they function, is that they act as the medium in this materialization of history. And then this history, in turn, informs present identity of a community. However, of course, history is never objective. So it is the history of from a specific point of view. And usually how it works is you have the people who are the elites in society, or the ones with the power, and they will usually fashion these memory sites in accordance to their own ideologies, and usually it will also be beneficial to their stay in power. And part of that also is then trying to consolidate all of collective memory within a group. Because when you do that, that is when you bring people together, and then that unit becomes even more powerful in their unity. And so by trying to consolidate or consolidate collective memory, you're also trying to erase any contradictions to that memory. So in the end, it's a competition of, at that moment, who has a bit more power and leverage, and when will they kind of stomp out that alternative view of history. And honestly, the best example that I could come up with today has to do with the Confederate statues. Because you have this debate going on two levels, where historically you had the microcosm of the South, and for them, the people who were in power, mostly white people, they wanted to reflect their ideals to a certain extent by celebrating their ancestors. But because these were also statues that were erected mostly during the Jim Crow years, you also see that this was also an attempt to try to reinforce the idea of segregation and inequality. And so that's when you see that now with the United States, a wider population sees itself as having moved beyond that. They no longer want to see these kind of symbols. Now, I don't want to sound as though I'm saying that erasing these symbols is bad. It's just an interesting dynamic of power that I wanted to touch upon. Specifically, in the Israeli context, so obviously Zionism as a political movement has been really effective in creating these memory sites for many reasons. First, you had, before the state, people who all shared a common heritage but came from different locations. Mostly they were from Europe and they were from a certain economic background, but there were still some different languages. And so you're trying to bring people together. Again, going back to this consolidation. And so the best and most efficient way to then assert this group as a unit, and that this unit has rights to the land, is then to reinforce past historical events. And of course, there are lots of places in Israel where you have archaeological excavations which do exactly that. It's basically what is considered to be proof of existence, proof of heritage, proof of history. One of the, I think, most best examples of this is Masada, where Masada became very popular during the late 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And this was a time, of course, where you had the IDF really becoming a strong power unit. And in Masada, you had this narrative of the valiant and heroic people who were willing to sacrifice themselves to remain true to their identity. And that's why people kept going to Masada, because it was this confirmation of this idea. However, in the only source that records the event, it's described as being a shameful defeat by cowardly suicide. So at that time, the people, or it was Josephus, I mean, he was Jewish but also Roman. At that time, those in power were Roman. So of course, it's going to be a defeat, it's going to be shameful. But then with the completely upturning of the narrative, you have a new way of understanding what happened in the past. So I think it's just a really straightforward way of understanding how easily a narrative can be changed, and also how powerful it can be. So Masada is a good example, but in trying to still establish this idea that memory can be configured in landscape, I also chose to explore a bit of the Western Wall, because I consider it to be a bit of a middle way between the Temple Mount and something very historical, straightforward, like Masada, because it has a bit of the elements of both, where it's very obvious that the Western Wall is a memory site because it's the memory site connected to the temple. But there are more elements to it in terms of how it was modified to emphasize a certain ideology. And that's what I find really fascinating in its history. So at first, the wall was just a small section of bricks among a larger section of bricks. There was nothing really special about it. It was that little red square. Again, not part of the temple, just part of the outside, later addition. And I have to say it out loud because you realize that this is an item that just has completely, oh shit. It just completely changed in significance. So initially, for example, the wall only had this amount of space in front of it to pray. Which is fascinating because after 1967, this big plaza was created. And in creating the plaza, there was a destruction of a Moroccan neighborhood that dated from the 12th century. So again, you have an erasure, I guess, of Arab presence to then create a plaza that would accommodate big Jewish celebrations, a triumphant version of getting what was lost in a certain way. This is a photo of the destruction, and this is a photo of the plaza. And so a plaza might not seem like such a powerful ideological representation, but it still kind of conveys the idea that this is a place to be celebrated, where you need to come together. There are ceremonies there all the time. So in a way, there are these kinds of changes that do then affect and reinforce a certain ideology. Now comes the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount was, of course, very, and has still remained very important to the religious community, but it isn't until post-1967 that it started gaining traction among non-religious people. But in reality, it was in the 1990s when it became almost like a pawn up for discussion during the peace process, where even secular Israelis realized that this is actually an important marker of our identity as a people. And this is when people started to become much more attached to it, to the idea that it actually should be under Israeli sovereignty. And in here we have the development of the movement I was previously talking about. And this is where I started making some of my links in a less refined way, which is that because this is a situation where physical modifications can be made in the ways where it was made at the Western Wall, you could say that the people who choose to go onto the complex are using the only method at their disposal, which is their presence, their physical bodies, as the way to commemorate this site. So here is a diagram of one of the groups and the trajectory that they do around the site. And I just want to kind of emphasize that the fact that they have planned it out in a way and they follow that path, it's another form of making tangible what was not so tangible before. That's not so eloquent, but it's a way of materializing a concept from the past. So they think that the Holy of Holies is right here, where it's drawn out. Other people have thought it's in other places. For example, in the middle one, if that one was the real one, technically they would be trespassing on the Holy of Holies. But because they have decided to kind of make their way around the temple in a certain way, this very precise way of circulating around is again reinforcing this idea that this is actually also a Jewish space. So, in the conclusion I was trying to make, and which I took too long to get to, I just wanted to make this link between trying to commemorate the past, but because of the current politics, commemorating the past can also be a form of wanting to instill like a different future. Reaffirming wanting, or not wanting the mosque and wanting the third temple. And I will go on from there in the future.
Thank you very much. I propose that we save questions until all the presentations have been heard, so that way we don't have to run into the difficulty of cutting any of the presenters short. Thank you very much, Chloe.
Thank you. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming today, and thank the graduate for attending this graduate student faculty conference. I would also like to thank the Azrieli Institute for the Montefiore Scholarship, as well as their unconditional support during my undergrad, as Professor Nikolenyi had mentioned, as the first graduate of the minor in Israel Studies, and my continuous research throughout the years. So before I get into the bulk of my presentation, I would like to give you a little context as to how I got involved in my interest in my research and into my interest, particularly with Israel studies. When I was 16, I had gone to Israel on an organized tour called Shorshim with Camp B'nai B'rith for 2 weeks. Following that, I went on March of Living, being a granddaughter of 2 Holocaust surviving grandparents and attending Herzliya High School. March of Living was something a part of our curriculum, meaning we were taught about the Holocaust, learned about it, and prepared for the trip and eventually go on the trip to Poland and later on Israel. Now I can say, although I had nearly fallen in love with Israel during my Shorshim experience, I think it was my time in Israel during March of Living that really made me love Israel, begin thinking as a Zionist, and truly wanting to be an activist here in Montreal for Israel. A couple of years had passed, all while having the Israeli fever and feeling this need to get back. I participated on a mission trip to South Africa and Israel with Rabbi Fishman of Beth Tikva Synagogue called Acharai, After Me. While South Africa was great and so much fun, I remember saying I'm only going on this trip to get back to Israel. And that's the reality. I said it. I cannot wait to get back to Israel. The purpose of the Acharai trip was to volunteer, and so in our sister city, Beersheba, the group was split into 2, and we went to work on rebuilding 2 bomb shelters that later on we had opened, that had been opened. By the end of the week, we had rebuilt 2 bomb shelters that had not been open and in use for a couple of years. We were able to extend our trip on Acharai, and so I extended for the first time for a week and a half. When it came to departure day and going back, I knew this would not be my last trip to Israel. I had hoped it would not take me as long as it did to get back. At this point, I was no longer eligible for Birthright, since I had participated on a subsidized organized trip, such as Shorshim, which was through the CIE, Canadian Israel Experience, and so I thought I would never get back to Israel because the plane ticket alone is so expensive. Then, by some miracle, Birthright eligibility rules changed, and I became eligible for Birthright. I chose to wait until I was eligible for the 22 to 26-year-old trip, as opposed to the 18 to 21-year-old trip. Because luckily, having been to Israel before, this time I wanted it to be different. I wanted to hear the stories and listen to the tour guide without distractions. I was more mature and completely dedicated to truly taking in the state of Israel, without feeling homesick or worrying about getting along with everyone, all while practicing my Hebrew and enjoying the Israeli culture. I applied for Birthright in the summer of 2015 and was waitlisted. It was mid-June when I got the call that they had opened a new bus, and I can get on with my friend who I was applying with at the time, but it leaves within 2 weeks. I said yes. I know I would be extending the trip as well, so it was all said and done, and I booked my return ticket for September 2nd. So I'd gone July, I think 5th, 6th, and then I extended till the 2nd of September. Let me be clear, if it were not for my Birthright trip, I don't think I would be researching what I am today, because the majority of the participants on my bus were of patrilineal descent, and for me that was a foreign concept. I was raised in an Orthodox, modern Orthodox home and attended Young Israel of Shamdi. So to me, when saying I am Jewish, being Jewish means having a Jewish mother of matrilineal descent. That being said, it took me a few days to warm up to the idea that many of these people refer to themselves as Jewish without having a Jewish mother or celebrating the holidays or even knowing a prayer. Coming from the Montreal Jewish community and being involved on campus, as well as in the community, I never really encountered this before. So the trip truly made me open and question what it means to be Jewish and how one identifies as being Jewish, which leads me to my research question, looking at the self-identification of Montreal young adults that have participated on Birthright. So why do people travel to Israel? More specifically, why do Jewish individuals travel to Israel? Why do Jews travel to Israel? Because the Torah told us so. Not like in Islam, where Muslims must travel to the Hajj and is a requirement to return to Mecca, traveling to Israel is not a requirement of God in Judaism. Yet the land has always been the ultimate home of the Jewish people, a place that had not existed before May 1948. In short, when Moses received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai from God, it had been said that any and all Jewish individuals were there standing with him at that time. Not all Jews support this view and do not support the idea of the State of Israel, so much so they will not acknowledge it until the return of the Mashiach. Nevertheless, after the Holocaust, and thanks to Britain and the United Nations, Jews have a land to call their own. Furthermore, on May 14, 1948, in Tel Aviv, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel and the Declaration of Independent States. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance. Hereby declared the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Yisrael to be known as the State of Israel. Moreover, within minutes of the state's establishment, it was announced that youth tours to Israel will be held within the coming summer, or at least within the next year. Eric Cohen states, with creation of the State of Israel, which for the centuries had been a religious symbol and messianic dream for most Jews, became a destination for migration and tourism. Israel is a central component of Jewish identity, even for those who have never visited it. For those who have, the visit may be an expression of pride and solidarity, an opportunity to explore the heritage, and a religious pilgrimage, as well as recreational vacation. Many participants in the educational tours describe the visit, particularly if it is the first visit to Israel, as a turning point in their lives, a peak experience. Having said that, tours to Israel exist in many forms, and there is no one-size-fits-all organized trip for everyone. Cohen, in his book Youth Tourism to Israel, Educational Experience of the Diaspora, does an excellent job describing and providing detailed information of different experiences that are available, as well as specifies the goals and purposes of Tiglit Birthright. For those of you who may not be familiar with Birthright, Birthright is a unique historical partnership between the people of Israel through their government, local Jewish communities, and leading Jewish philanthropists. Founded by Charles Bronfman and Michael Steinhardt in 1999, Birthright Israel provides a gift of peer group educational trips to Israel for Jewish young adults ages 18 to 26. Put differently, Birthright is a free trip for young adults to Israel ages 18 to 26. Over the last years, it's changed to months, they have changed the eligibility to age 32. It is no longer just a standard 10-day trip, day experience. It has somewhat become a rite of passage for the young adults in the college world. So why travel to Israel on Birthright? A cynical and almost exploitative reason for traveling to Israel on Birthright is because it is free. As Jews, we kind of like things that are free. Besides for Birthright Israel having a natural meaning and association behind it, there's a core element of the Birthright Israel experience that is humane. We live in an era where people have the time and ability to travel abroad more than ever before. Millennials and people within this age demographic want to travel. Travel is much more accessible nowadays, and it is almost expected. At the core of Birthright Israel experience is the desire and want to travel and see the world. In addition to the spiritual connection, historical, cultural aspects of the trip, there's that primal millennial desire of seeing and experiencing the world outside of my bubble and community, which is at the core of it as well. So much so that it is an experience where participants have stated that it has changed their lives. Thus, I would now like to tell you about my field research and the 3 interviews I conducted with Birthright alumni. I can see this as a pilot study on my research, which gave me some clear direction as to where, how, and what to do to get alumni interested in participating in my research. And so the first network I used was Facebook. Each Birthright bus has their respective Facebook group, and so I posted about my research searching for participants who wanted to tell me their story about Birthright and their experiences. While I got many likes on the post, only one participant responded, Alexandra. My second participant was another graduate student in the department that had participated on Birthright's honeymoon to Israel, who wishes to remain anonymous. Lastly, Jake is the boyfriend of a friend of mine that I had met for the first time a few weeks ago and was willing to be interviewed. Jake lives in Toronto, and due to the time constraints and challenging schedules, Jake and I were not able to do a face-to-face interview, nor via Skype or FaceTime. Instead, he completed the questionnaire via email. The questionnaire was more of my list of questions to be asked during the interview, composed of the demographic section and 3 main sections, pre, during, and post-trip. In each section, I asked a question dealing with the themes of nation, homeland, and identity. How do you identify yourself? What or how do you view Israel as a nation? What or how do you view Israel as a homeland? An overview of some of the findings were that when growing up in a Jewish family, along any of the denominations, Orthodox, Reform, or Conservative denominations, there had already been a connection to Israel, even though none of the participants had ever been to Israel prior to Birthright. When asked about the viewpoints of Israel as a nation and a homeland, Jake's response was, Israel is the home of the Jewish people and entirely belongs to them. It is the external home of the Jewish people. Alexandra's response was, I really identify with this small little country that struggles with so many odds and comes out on top. Really just want to be a part of it. I really just want to be a part of it and this project. I saw Israel as a nation state of Jewish people. We're Jews who live in Judea. We finally got it back. It was always ours. All kinds of literature acknowledge it before 1948. We have a very long history there, despite being kicked out of the colonized powers. And it actually is the reason why she believes in God. After the Holocaust, we didn't even have any uniforms fighting 7 Arab armies, but the fact was we had won, and that came from God. It must have been an act from God. When asking about one's identity, the responses were varied. Jake identified before, during, and after the trip as a conservative Jew. Alexandra identified as first, Canadian second. Observant, non-observant, but having gone on Birthright and making Aliyah, she became more observant, especially when in Israel, and identifies as modern Orthodox. My anonymous participant had participated on the most recent trip of Birthright, honeymoon to Israel, as mentioned before, with her partner. She is not Jewish, but her partner is of matrilineal descent who is non-observant. And both would identify as spiritual, and over the last year have become involved in Chabad. All of the participants had heard about Birthright from someone they had known who had gone on the trip. Jake had heard about the trip from friends and family as well as community involvement and had a great desire to go to Israel. Alexandra states, everyone knows about Birthright. In 6th grade saying I want to go on Birthright, I was saying I want to go on Birthright. Unless you're completely off from the Jewish community, then everyone knows about it. Hillel is constantly posting about it. If you're not connected some way, you're either not going to know about it or understand the advertisements. She applied for Birthright alone and was worried it would be her last year to apply, so she did not want to miss the opportunity as she was 24 and would not know if she could get the time off in the future. She had extended her trip by 8 days and was the only participant of my study to extend the trip due to timing and work requirements back home. Jake had gone on Birthright in 2009 at the age of 18. His mother had converted to Judaism and had an Orthodox conversion. Even before going to Israel, he knew he wanted to enlist and serve in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. His grandmother had volunteered in Israel and told him all of these stories, and so hearing firsthand about her experience and the experiences of the Israeli soldiers on the Mifgash affirmed his feelings of joining. He served as a paratrooper during 2012 and made Aliyah during his service. The anonymous participant had gone on Birthright in November 2017. Her partner has had a spiritual experience on his Birthright trip, and he came back completely different, as she states. The short story is, while he was there, he had some sort of awakening and proposed to her while on the trip. I was like, I need to spend the rest of my life with you, and I need to show you Israel. All these new conceptions of time and money means nothing, and time means everything. So that was really impactful to him and to them as a couple. He ended up quitting his job and starting writing a book about his grandparents' past. The importance about looking at Jewishness and atrocities of his family, because they had no information of what their experience has been. So he took a year off to write the book, started writing and researching. She had helped him a little bit with the research, and the plan was next year they would go backpacking through Europe, but also make it a research trip, and the last leg of the trip would go to Israel, because he wanted to bring her back to Israel. When asked the two questions, what or how view Israel as a nation, prior to going to the trip, her main reservation about Israel was that she did not support Israel as a nation. She had a serious qualms politically. As much as she is not super well versed in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, she knew about it given her studies in indigenous populations. So there's often that link drawn to colonization, and certainly she knows about the BDS movement. She never attended protests because she never felt well versed enough to really side, but she certainly leads toward pro-Palestinian rather than pro-Israel. While she was never necessarily anti-Israelis, she was anti-Israel as a nation and what she believed that they stand for. As she states, she certainly left-leaning and understood more. She had a better understanding of the lived experience of Palestinians rather than the lived experience of Israelis in Israel, and gave credence to their lived experience of Israeli lived experiences. Sorry, I think that didn't make sense. Being as she viewed the Israeli government as the conquerors and being unjust to the Palestinians, she's a realist. There are borders in the world, and she understands nations often do things that don't take into consideration the people that it affects. Given that she is very anti-capitalist and power moves, very opposed to Israel as a nation, did not persuade her husband from not going on Birthright. She understands and understood why many Jews believe it is their birthright. She doesn't think it's up to her to tell people what to support or who to believe. Believe is their homeland. She does believe that people feel strong connections in terms of identity to places. In this case, the country, land, history stems from this place. But this is the case in Israel, not only for Jews, but also Muslims and Christians. It's a trifecta, just coming together in one place, and that it is the birthplace of religion, and she believes that it's telling. I'm going to skip ahead just a bit. Certainly, she had a stronger opposition to an organized trip like Birthright because she does feel there was a hidden agenda, given what she had heard from the other people and her own research. But for her husband, he came back jaded from that trip, having some of the ideas that she had prior to him going, but she had never shared with him. They're trying to sell you on this country, she says, because politically, Israel needs support from Canadians, from U.S. citizens. Her understanding is that a lot of these trips are endorsed by wealthy people who identify as Jewish. They are, and Birthright don't outright admit it, but Aliyah is a part of their agenda. Try to get a lot more wealthy Westerners to immigrate, or at least continue supporting in tourism. For her, it was a money power thing, so certainly a political agenda for Birthright. So when I asked about Aliyah, and I asked her to go forward on those thoughts, she states, there's an essentialist view on Birthright. There's something fundamentally essentialist in the ideology of Birthright, that participants and their families want to go to Israel, and families send them to Israel. That is your home, and you need to protect it. She feels exactly that this is what Birthright is doing. She doesn't fault them for it, but she doesn't support it. She doesn't understand why they are doing it. You're a nation, you're in a very difficult political position, so she kind of gets it, but not really. Also, financial support. So if you are tying Judaism specifically to Israel while using not only the fact that Jews have been persecuted way before the Holocaust, there were pogroms, fascinated of the history, and the anti-Semitism in the world that perpetrates forever, you would have expected it to dissipate after the Holocaust. And while it's no longer politically correct to be anti-Semitic, oh my God, it has changed. Instead of anti-Semitism, it's now anti-Israel. So she positioned herself post-trip. Yes, she certainly has came back. A very interesting thing before the trip, she would mention Palestine. She would never use the term Israel. So now she does acknowledge and state Israel and makes the difference between that. Before the trip, she didn't do that. But she's still very set and stern in her understanding of it, that Israel is a land of many cultures and religions. She had some emotional experiences. The most impactful experience for her was going to the Wailing Wall. But the most emotional experience, and that she had never felt in her entire life, she felt jolted from this experience, is she was standing overlooking Syria, and you're in Israel and you see Syria and Lebanon to the other sides, and Damascus was decimated and bombed out. And then that for her just made her feel that, like, this is only a reality in Israel. We don't have to think about these things in Montreal. But that is also the beauty of being in Israel, that you feel safe there even when bombs are going off. So it's a contradiction and a juxtaposition throughout her entire trip. And she feels more not welcome now in the Montreal Jewish community, specifically in Chabad, because her participants, I see your reactions and I'll explain it, because her participants were saying, like, you go to Chabad, they're just talking behind your back, they're not actually accepting you, they just want you to come and have Jewish babies. So yes, when she came back from Birthright, they had the conversation, her and her partner had the conversation of conversion, but then she doesn't want to have children later on, so being in the Chabad community, maybe it wouldn't be the right fit for her to convert in through Hasidism and Orthodoxy, but there are definitely other denominations that I can suggest for her to convert.
Wow, thank you very much. But hopefully you will engaging what I have to say. So what I wanted to share with you, we always, this is a standard format. We usually try to pair up either one graduate student with one faculty member. Today we have of course, the benefit of having two graduate students. So this is fantastic. It really shows, hopefully, that this event, as previous events, will show you the different questions we ask, the different disciplinary backgrounds that we are engaged in as we do Israel studies here at Concordia. The paper that I wanted to share with you, rather the beginning of the paper that I'm working on with a colleague of mine, Professor Rohit Dasgupta, who is a professor of European and Israel Studies at Jindal University, which is located in India. It comes out of a short research stay that I spent at her center last fall. That wasn't my first time in India. It was my second. My wife and I lived there for about 10 months when we were much younger than I would like to admit. But this time I really had a fantastic opportunity to teach and engage students and faculty at that center about Israel. And it was really just a natural next step for Rohi and me to actually start raising questions that are of common interest. And it didn't take long before we actually hit upon this very interesting question that is commonly known both to observers and followers of Indian and Israeli politics, but much less studied, and certainly much less studied systematically, either in the two respective national or in the comparative constitutional politics literatures. And the question that we want to raise is as follows. The question, the puzzle, is the same that was recently raised by Hannah Lerner, a professor of constitutional politics at Tel Aviv University. Given the overwhelming superiority and given the apparently large majority that secular political forces had both in early state Israel, in the early state Israeli legislature, as well as in early post-independence India, why is it that in both of these new democracies, that emerge out of the Second World War, we see these secular forces conceding tremendously to religious political parties and religious political forces. In the case of India, these concessions are manifesting themselves in particular aspects of the Indian constitution that I will mention in a few minutes. In Israel, they manifest themselves in particular concessions that were much less formalized, simply having to do with the less formalized nature of the unfolding saga of Indian Israeli constitutional politics. unlike India, Israel to this day doesn't have a single written codified document called the Israeli Constitution, which doesn't, of course, mean that there is no constitutionality in Israeli politics. In stark contrast, India does have this. In both cases, I'm going to point out in a moment, we do have very important elements, very important documents that make it very clear that secular forces conceded territory to the religious parties, to the religious forces. And the puzzle is why that happened, when given how strong the religious parties and forces were, that wasn't necessary. Now, there have been a number of attempts, both in the Indologist and the Israel studies literature, and really Hannah's work on India, Israel, and Ireland, her work engages Ireland on the same question as well, that offers some very interesting possible solutions. Her answer, and that is really where the wisdom is currently in the literature today, Lerner's argument is that the reason why both in Israel and in India, the secular forces made these accommodations towards the religious parties had to do with the fact that politics and times were very difficult at the moment. The evacuation and the departure of the British forces in 1947 from the subcontinent was happening under conditions of poor planning. Everything was done. The negotiations with the Indian National Congress Party, the drawing up of the territorial grants that eventually created Pakistan and India out of the formerly undivided subcontinent, was done without adequate preparation on the part of the British. And so when the Indian national leadership inherits the moment of actually writing a new constitution and laying down the new policies that are going to be informing the policies and the future laws of the land, it makes sense, argues Lerner, it made sense to buy time, to buy peace. And in order to bring the religious groups on side and without inciting, and to make sure that religious passions and religious conflicts are not going to be fueled, the accommodations were made. What forms these accommodations made, I'm going to elaborate in a few minutes. On the Israeli side, Lerner argues we see the exact same type of reasoning. In preparing for the November 1947 meeting and vote at the United Nations, the secular Zionist leadership of the Zionist organizations, the Jewish Agency at the time, chaired by David Ben-Gurion, who, as was mentioned earlier, will become the first prime minister of the new state, secures a very important document, the famous status quo document, in which a number of concessions are promised to the ultra-Orthodox communities of the Yishuv, eventually of the future Israeli state. And these important concessions committed that while Israel is going to be as much as possible a secular state, when it comes to the national observance of Jewish holidays, when it comes to Shabbat and the national holidays will be Jewish. When it comes to personal status issues, they are going to be administered and adjudicated according to Jewish religious law, and the rabbinic tribunals eventually are going to be in charge of making the appropriate legal preparations and judgments. When it comes to Jewish dietary restrictions, the status quo letter also promised that government institutions and public institutions, when they are providing food, they are going to do so respecting Jewish dietary traditions. And so the point here to stress, and what is very important to remember, is that as Israel embarks on the journey of statehood, there is already in place this very important accommodation and compromise between the secular Zionist leadership and the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate or the ultra-Orthodox forces, at this time represented by Agudat Yisrael. Now, when the dust settles, and Israel eventually is declared, as Chloe mentioned, in May 1948, and the dust settles on the war, and Israel eventually embarks on peaceful electoral and regular legislative politics. The opportunity presents itself in the Knesset, for the secular political parties and for the secular politicians, Knesset members, to actually revisit the status quo letter. They had the numbers, but they decided to forego and not to implement it. One important reason why that didn't happen has to do with the decision not to write an Israeli constitution, even though the promise was made in the Declaration of Independence, that within a short period of time, Israel will emerge with a new constitution. Under the terms of the famous Harari proposal, the Knesset deferred the decision about future constitutional legislating to the Knesset Constitutional Law and Justice Committee, agreeing that this committee in the future will draft Megillah by Megillah, as sometimes we say, basic law by basic law, important legislation that eventually at some point later down in the road is going to add up to a new Israeli constitution. So that today still hasn't happened. Again, in both of these cases, Lerner sees very important elements of buying time in order to make sure that Israel, in the Israeli case, and India, in the context of the subcontinent, again facing the departure of the British, facing the conflagration that accompanied the partition of India and Pakistan, single largest movement of populations in world history, also characterized by tremendous loss of life. Buying time, not to inflame and conceding to the religious forces, argues Lerner, is made perfect sense. So what Rohi and I do is simply, and I'm not going to provide you with more history because there is no point in doing that in this context. I would really need a timeline that would provide more help. But what I want to share with you is our reasoning of why we disagree with the fundamental gist of this argument that Lerner presents. While we appreciate the importance of political prudence and the notion of buying time, we simply don't share Hannah's argument in terms of why subsequent opportunities would also have been missed. And I already alluded to earlier that the secular political forces in Israel were in a position not to have to concede after the first election in 1949. In the next election, the dominant position of the Israeli Labour Party, Mapai, together with the other left Zionist forces, together with the other secular right-wing political forces, would have ensured easily that if religion is an important enough agenda on the or item on the agenda to change the status quo, it would have been done. Similarly, in India, there were plenty of opportunities after the first election in 1952, second election 1957, and thereafter, when the avowedly secular Indian National Congress Party would have been in a position to change the concessions that were made to the religious forces in India. Now, granted, unlike in the case of Israel, where I mentioned there was no constitution, so the status quo, the concessions to the religious forces was much more political rather than legal. In the case of India, this concession actually was constitutionalized. The limitation on Indian secularism came in the shape of what's called the section of the Indian constitution called the Directive Principles on State Policy. And in that section of the Indian constitution, there is provision against creating a uniform civil code. And what that absence does, what the absence of a uniform civil code does, essentially giving the power to the religious communities, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish in India, to manage personal status issues over members of their community, much the same way as the religious communities have in Israel. But this concession has the power of constitutional entrenchment in India, but of course doesn't do so in Israel. Another point that's important to note with respect to the directive principles of the Indian constitution is that this part of the constitution in India is not subject to judicial review. So it is very entrenched, it is very protected. The question still remains why it wasn't changed, especially given the enormous parliamentary majorities that the secular Indian Congress Party kept winning election after election until 1977, and then again even thereafter until 1989. So while Lerner's argument explains the beginning, doesn't really explain the continuity. And our argument is much more political, not surprisingly because both of us are political scientists, Rohi and I. Our argument is that the truth of the story, that the convincing, or not the truth, but the more convincing gist of the story lies in the strategy of political dominance. Both on the part of Mapai, the predecessor of the Israeli Labour Party in Israel, and the Indian National Congress Party in India. Operating under two different electoral systems, but still both of these formations that found themselves in leadership positions at the time of independence in India, at the time of the creation of the state and the end of issue of politics in Israel, were situated and had the political motivation to create a new political program that would fundamentally cement and perpetuate their dominant position of authority. In of these cases, they reached out, while the Indian National Congress Party had to reach out to the religious forces, and I'm going to explain the logic in a moment, and that's exactly why Mapai reaches out to perpetuate its own secular dominant position in the Israeli case. In the case of India, like with many other elements of the constitutional, the institutional architecture, India inherits the British first-past-the-post electoral system. We probably all know how to we know all too well how it works from our Canadian, American examples. In India, religious, both caste Hindu as well as Muslim communities constituted, and the Congress Party very clearly understood that at the time when the first electoral districts are drafted, constituted powerful electoral blocks distributed in key positions across the various states, especially in the Hindi heartland, but also in the south, where you find particularly important concentrations of the Muslim population. To make sure, and this becomes an operative political electoral strategy for the Indian Congress Party, to attract to the party itself these voting blocks of the caste Hindus as well as the Muslim communities. The Congress Party becomes the party of the minorities, and thus is actually able to build an electoral strategy that keeps bringing the party back time and time again in each election. So the reason why, it may be the case that the reason why the Congress Party defers to the religious forces at the beginning of the dawn of Indian constitutional history may be, as Lerner argues, in order to buy time. But why it keeps happening is much better explained by the electoral positioning of the Muslim and the particularly conservative, rurally based Hindu constituencies, religious constituencies, which become a very important voting bloc in the strategy of the Indian Congress Party. And the Indian electoral politics literature backs up our argument, we find very convincingly. Now in Israel of course doesn't start out with the first-past-the-post electoral system. Respecting the decision of the United Nations, the new Jewish state adopts a parliamentary system of government and a proportional representation system, which is actually called for also in the partition resolution by the UN. So the reason why Mapai, Ben-Gurion's Mapai, needs to reach out to the religious political parties is not rooted in the same kind of grassroots electoral calculations. There are no districts in Israel to speak of. The entire country is made up of one large electoral district. Ben-Gurion, however, so that's the story is slightly, the mechanics are slightly different. The story is the same, the mechanics are different. Ben-Gurion is very clear in his recognition and understanding that to his political and to the political position of Mapai, the religious parties will never be a threat. There will only and always be only so many Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox religious folks in Israel, and certainly at the time when even their political involvement couldn't be taken for granted, that will not be a threat. For him, the threat comes from the secular establishment, from the secular forces. And very famously, already at the time of the first election, Ben-Gurion sums up his political program. Never in government with Maki, the Communist Party, we never go to the left, and never with Herod. This is par excellence the strategy of centrism. We want to be in the center, and the only long-term reliable partners who are not going to be messing up this strategy are the religious folks, because they couldn't care less about ideology in the secular sense of the term. For them, political involvement, if and when it happens, only has to do with religious questions. So the same way as Ben-Gurion carves out a centrist position in the political map and builds the strategy of centrist dominance, the same process we also see in India under the leadership of Jawaharlal Nehru, whose centrism is more electorally district-driven, simply because there the first-past-the-post electoral system encourages the party to always appeal to the plurality, to the largest local voting blocks, which in the Indian case were exactly the religious parties to whom the secular concessions or the concessions on limiting secularism in the Indian constitutions appeal. So there's the story. What's original, we think, in our argument is the insight and how we make sense of history. We consciously don't look for new evidence. We simply think that the evidence that learner also uses, we can put together differently in order to shed light, in order to provide an explanation that is consistent with what she says, the moment of the concession, the moment when secularism is limited, but our argument, we think, also explains the subsequent unfolding of these politics and these political histories in Israel and India. On that point, I'm going to end my talk. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And the floor is now open for questions and answers. And all I would just ask that when you ask your question, please, now you know about our speakers, but we may not know about you. So tell us who you are, and please address your question pointedly to the speaker of your choice. Chloe and Jessica, do you want to come up and meet us? So yes, the floor is open. Professor Robinson.
Okay, my name is Ira Robinson, and I teach in the Department of Religions and Cultures. And I want to thank everybody, but first I want to ask something of Chloe, because I was struck by your diagram of the path taken by the Jewish groups on the Temple Mount. And it amounts to a circumambulation, walking around a holy site. And there is a, in pilgrimage, there is, this is rather a big thing. In Islam, circumambulating around the Kaaba, for instance. In India, I believe also circumambulation of holy sites is done. So my question is, from your study of these groups, is this a conscious thing, or do they, or is this simply, well, we want to keep out of the way of where we believe the holy place is, so we're going to go around the fringes?
That's a really good question. I hadn't really considered how consciously the decision was made. Of course, I knew it's because keeping in the fringes of what they considered as being, acceptable or not. But I guess, to a certain extent, I think of more of the experience of pilgrimage and what that gives what that offers the person doing the pilgrimage. It's a much more dynamic way of experiencing it, and
anyway, it's worth looking into,
Yeah.
I think.
Circumambulation. I was thinking along those lines as I was watching Chloe's arrows. And you're right, in India, well, certainly Buddhist temples do have that process. When we were in India, my wife and I visited the place where the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And yes, people were going around. Well, I don't need to tell you, of course, we walked exactly in the wrong reverse direction. Which partly was intentional, but we didn't do it for too long, just to be respectful. But that was interesting.
although that was just for one group. I couldn't find any diagrams of any other groups.
Well, there's a very recent book in Hebrew that's on my nightstand, and it's about third or fourth in line, but it's about precisely these groups.
Okay.
And I'll be very interested to see whether there is any consciousness of circumambulation or what.
Thank you. Dr. Joseph.
I have a lot. Okay, so just one of the things that connected both Chloe and Jessica's talks was the issue of tourism. So Chloe, I think one of the things that connects, that's different about you make points about Masada and the wall and differentiate it from the Temple Mount, but one of the big things that differentiates these memory sites, and I agree with you that they're different, is that both Masada and the wall are being used by the tourist industry in Israel and in North America to promote tourism, but Temple Mount is not. And so watching that, the creation of it as a memory site by a small group, which is growing, it's changing. In 67 and 68, even in the early 70s, Temple Mount was not a group or a memory site even. Now it is, so watching that. But certainly it's different because the tourist industry is not going near it. But it is going very near Masada, and now much more the wall. And even Masada has been downplayed, and the wall is back up again. So that's interesting. But Birthright is also a big tourism industry. So whatever people think of Birthright, and I would encourage you to read the literature about Birthright because there's been great controversy over it.
100%.
In the literature. And when people say it's changed my life, the actual long-term studies have begun to indicate that hasn't changed anybody's life. So there's real interest, but the tourist industry is what's promoting it also. So that's a big part that people don't talk about. It's not just about going there. It's about one of the things that's promoting it is that tourism was down, especially Jewish tourism. Evangelical tourism was up. Jewish tourism was down. So we had to invent Birthright and even March of the Living to bring Jewish tourism back. So thinking about those economic considerations will contextualize some of your findings, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I definitely the literature. There are three main sources of Birthright books that I've been using. The literature is within the scholars themselves have contemplated the trip itself. It's not the participants, it's the scholars and researchers and even the funders, founding fathers of the of the trip itself that question the purpose of it, why are they doing it. I did not look at it as an economic way, but obviously it supports the state of Israel, all of these tourists going. But I have not thought of that to put that in as a section in my thesis later on. Although on every Birthright trip, Masada is still a given. It's like a mandated thing, a mandated place to visit on Birthright trips. So you do the wall and you do go to Masada each trip, and they tell the story.
And they overtell the story.
Exactly.
In much in the same vein, there is a book, maybe you are using it already, Jessica, The New American Zionism by Ted Cohn. One of the chapters is looking at tourism, and he's using Taglit and similar data, so that may be helpful to consider.
As a sociologist, I'm not a sociologist yet, but in sociology, I've definitely seen, done research on the tourism industry itself and how they position it in the tourist industry. But in terms of religion and religious studies, it's just mentioned briefly, but it's not continuously brought about.
Dr. Robinson.
Okay, Csaba, I was struck by your mention of 1977 as a key year for political change in India, where Congress Party faltered in its strength. And it struck me that that's the very same year that Mapai, the Israel Labor Party, faltered. And, is there any structural connection, or is it just a coincidence in your view?
There is a structural connection, and the structural connection has to do with generational cohorts, right? Two new nations, two new democracies, people and the leaderships. If you look at the people who are actually in leadership positions at the time of independence, at the time the state of Israel is created, very, very comparable. So there is something along the lines that we can tell about what political change and relating to political change to the regular life cycle of political cohorts replacing each other, and new cohorts coming in, coming of age, voting differently, changing their position. So a new generation, a new political generation has come of age in both cases. What's interesting is that right at the same time, these new political generations get mobilized, and mobilized very successfully. but there is no immediate connection other than this very deep point about the replacement of generational cohorts that we can say. But you're absolutely right, and there are other interesting commonalities when bit connecting the two countries' political histories. 67 was formative for both of them, 77 and so forth. So you're 100% right to note that, Ira. If there are no other questions, I'm looking at Jennifer just to get an indication if there is more pizza.
I guess.
Yeah, so there is more pizza. We have the room for another 5 minutes. That should give us enough time to eat the remaining pizza. And by all means, please join our presenters in small talk, hobby conversations if you have questions that you always wanted to know the answer to, but we're always afraid to ask publicly. So this may be your time. Other than that, I would like to thank you again for joining us today. And please come again. We have a very rich month of March ahead of us at the Institute, several exciting guest speakers. On March 22nd, we have a professor from India visiting us. We have all the upcoming events flyers located for your convenience at the table. So please stay in touch with us. We look forward to seeing you at one of our forthcoming events. And on that note, please join me in a round of applause to